Welcome. I'm Karen Chance Mercurius, the Director of Alumni Relations at Harvard Law School, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm delighted to welcome our featured speaker, Emily Leib, JD Class of 2008, Assistant Clinical Professor of Law, Director of the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, and Deputy Director of the Harvard Law School Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation. Professor Leib co-founded and directs the Food Law and Policy Clinic, the first law school clinic in the nation devoted to providing legal and policy solutions to nonprofit and government clients in order to address the health, economic, and environmental challenges facing our food system. Professor Leib is recognized as a national leader in food law and policy. She teaches courses on the topic and focuses her scholarship and practice on finding solutions to today's biggest food system issues, aiming to increase access to healthy foods, prevent diet-related disease, eliminate food waste, and reduce barriers to market entry for small-scale and sustainable food producers. Professor Leib has published scholarly articles in the Wisconsin Law Review, the Harvard Law and Policy Review, and the Journal of Food Law and Policy, among others, and was recently featured on CBS This Morning on June 8, 2016. All participants in today's HLeX open lecture will have the opportunity to submit questions. Please use the questions panel on your screen at any time during the presentation. We will be addressing questions at the end of Professor Leib's presentation. Professor Leib, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's joining in for the webinar. I'm excited to be able to tell you a little bit about my work and about the Food Law and Policy Clinic, and then to hear some of your questions and get to answer them. So the Food Law and Policy Clinic is a division of the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation at Harvard Law School. And just to tell you a little bit about us, like many clinics here, we sort of serve a dual mission. One angle is that we are serving clients and organizations, and the other is that we're educating students. So there are, as you can see here, we serve clients, we're training students. The students are getting to learn about the laws that really structure the food system from production through sales, through consumption, through waste. And then the students are getting to work on skills such as writing, thinking about policy solutions and strategy, oral advocacy and presentations, community development and community organizing. So they're getting a lot of different skills, and I'm going to talk through today work that we've done in a few areas so you can get a sense for some of that. I'm going to focus on work we've done in the food waste arena, which has been a really exciting area for us and has gotten a lot of traction nationally. And then I'll tell you about some of our work within the initiative Community Empowerment, which is working with food policy councils, and I'll tell you what those are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the clinic fits into the field of food law and policy nationally and some of the work that we've done to build this field of law. So to begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about food waste. And I'm going to start with this map, which shows a little bit about food waste, food loss and waste globally. And what's really interesting that you can see here is we're wasting billions of pounds of food. About a third of the food we produce, 1.3 billion tons, to be exact, is wasted globally. And what's interesting about this map is that you can see in most parts of the world, with the exception of North America, the bulk of that is food loss, which means food that is lost between harvest in the field along the distribution chain before it gets into consumer homes. And by contrast, here in North America, the bulk of the waste, more of the waste actually happens after that point. So a lot of it is happening in retail stores, restaurants, and specifically in the consumer home. So this is really a global issue. There's been efforts around the world to focus on this, and we've been really involved in looking at what are the ways that this is impacting American consumers, the environment here, our landfills, and then what can be done in terms of policy to address that. So in terms of what this looks like in the U.S., as you can see here, we waste about 40% of the food that we produce, so almost half. So it would be as if every time you went to the grocery store, you bought 5 bags of groceries, left 2 of them in the parking lot or in the dumpster on the way home. So it's a lot of food wasted, and this is a waste of natural resources. More than 20% of water that we use on producing food in the U.S. goes to produce food we then throw away, 4% of our oil, 18% of our cropland. And food, once it's in the landfill, is a huge contributor to methane emissions, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So there's a lot of environmental reasons to care about this beyond just the cost of that food that's being wasted. Because of all of this, we had an announcement last September of the first ever National Food Waste Reduction Goal in the U.S., and you can see there the Secretary of USDA and Commissioner of EPA announcing that joint goal. And the goal is that we reduce food waste by 50% by the year 2030. So it's been very exciting, and I'm going to tell you about some of the work we've done to help try to achieve that in partnership with these agencies and many others. And this is a goal that a lot of other countries have signed on to and are working at their own national levels to figure out how they're going to achieve that. The way that we first got involved in food waste, and a place where we've been working for several years, is around the issue of date labels on food products. And for those who saw the CBS This Morning clip that was sent around, or that Karen mentioned, that was what I was speaking about last week. Every group that has looked at food waste in the U.S., in other countries as well, has said, someone really needs to better understand the date labels on food and how those are contributing to food waste. So we took up this challenge a couple years ago in a report you can see here called The Dating Game that we published in partnership with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And what we did was we took up this question of what do these date labels mean, how are they defined in law, how are they regulated, what can we do to make them better. So I'm going to talk through that report, and what we've really learned over time is that there are 2 main issues with date labels. One is that there is no federal law, so there's a dizzying patchwork of state laws that are not based in science, not based in sound public policy. And then the other issue is that consumers are very confused, and so I'll talk about that a little bit. And again, all of these projects we work on, this report and others, these are all the product of many hours of work of our students doing interviews and legal research and trying to figure out how do we convey these points and identify policy strategies to improve some of these issues. So in terms of date labels, what we found is that at the federal level, date labels are generally undefined. And this is very surprising to many people. Most people think that, like so many other elements on our packages, the nutrition facts panel and other labels and calorie labels, things like that, that these are also regulated, but in fact at the federal level the only food that the date label, for which the date label is regulated, is the use by date on infant formula. So for all other foods the federal government doesn't regulate them, and in fact the Food and Drug Administration has said in the past that part of the reason they don't regulate these is because they are not linked to safety, which is also very surprising. Most people think that these are safety based. Instead they are suggestions of peak quality by manufacturers for the most part. So this has been an issue. How do we make that more clear to people? So the bulk of our research then was trying to understand, since these aren't regulated at the federal level, where are the laws coming from and what are the requirements with regard to date labels. So we did a 50-state study, and you can see here there's 2 charts I'm going to show you. This first one shows that 41 states regulate and by requiring date labels on at least certain foods. And it's a little bit hard to see, but at the key at the bottom you can see that they're all different foods. So in fact every state that's regulating these is regulating different foods. 2 that are common are shellfish and dairy, but even within dairy some states regulate the date label on cream but not milk, and some regulate on grade A milk but not other milk, and they are really all over the board, which I think is further evidence that they're not based in safety and not based in science. And then even more problematic is the fact that 20 states, which you can see here, restrict the sale or donation of food past the date label. So I'll give a few examples. Here in Massachusetts, date labels are required on all perishable and semi-perishable food products, and then any food that has a date label either because it was required or because it was voluntarily placed there by a manufacturer or retailer can only be sold after the date if it is wholesome, clearly marked as being past date, and segregated from other food. So that makes it challenging. There's a lot of food that's past date that gets thrown away in Massachusetts because of those restrictions. For example, the local food banks have said we can't really comply with those, so we just aren't going to take past date food, even though much of it is still very safe. Montana is another good example. They require that milk have a date on it that is 12 days after the milk was pasteurized, which is half the time that most milk producers will usually put. They put about 21 days on. So the milk has to have a date that's 12 days from pasteurization, and then it cannot be sold or donated after that date. It has to be thrown away. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So there's obviously a lot of food that's being labeled in ways that are required by state law but aren't really based in science, and then being required to be thrown away or not sold or donated. So that's one piece of the issue. And the other issue is that consumers are very confused. Whether their state regulates this or not, people don't understand what those dates mean. So earlier this year, we did a national survey with the National Consumers League and Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future that really aimed to get at this other question about what are consumers doing with food after the date. And you can see here just a few of our results. What we found was that of people always or usually throw food away when that date happens, no matter what. They just grab it out of the refrigerator, grab it out of their cabinet, throw it right in the trash. And then 84% of consumers say that at least with certain foods, or at least in certain situations, they throw that food away because they're afraid that it's unsafe. 36% of consumers also wrongly think that date labels are federally regulated, and I think this is really important too. We've been sort of saying these dates are very misleading and they're causing people to waste good food, waste money. So the fact that people think that the date on there is federally regulated means that they think it's giving them some meaning, which it's clearly not. And interestingly, only 1% of people correctly answered the question, and the correct answer was that only certain products are regulated at the federal level. And as I said earlier, that product would be infant formula. So we also looked a little bit, I'm not going to go into detail here, but just to show, we looked a little bit at what foods in particular people tend to throw away after the use-by date. So you can see there some of the ones are like raw chicken, deli meats, pasteurized milk, etc. But some of these products, many of them are still safe. Pasteurized milk is a good example. Because it's pasteurized, that is killing any contamination or potentially harmful pathogens. So actually milk is one of the products that is safe after the date and will may decline in quality, but that's actually a matter of taste, and we've had experiments where we've groups of us have tasted past date milk, milk that we left out, spoiled milk even, and have found that it actually differs from person to person. We were in the company of a food safety expert, so thankfully we knew we were doing something that wasn't going to get anyone sick, but he basically said this is about taste and not about safety, and many people don't know that. On the flip side, there's also a mistaken belief that pre-date food is always safe to consume, and that can be harming people as well because they're looking at these dates and not making good decisions about things that really should be refrigerated or frozen or kept in some other way. And the last thing to say here is that there are a handful of foods that actually can be unsafe after the date, and so our work has been trying to kind of create a standard that gives them a separate label so that people can really, when they see those foods, and clearly understand that. And one example from this list of products here is deli meats, which you know, are perfectly safe to eat, but they do have a risk of contamination that could become worse over time. So if you have them in your refrigerator for weeks and weeks, those are one that actually people should be more careful about. And lastly, in our survey, we looked at we tested out 6 different potential labels on food products to get a better sense of what people thought did indicate quality versus safety, so that if we wanted to standardize labels and make them clearer when they really are about quality, and then have a separate label for foods like I mentioned, deli meats or unpasteurized cheese would be another one, and have a different label on those. And we found, as you can see here, that certain labels do seem to already be communicating that. The strongest ones that show quality would be best if used by or best by. And then in terms of labels that indicate safety, expires on really won out there. And that really comported with earlier focus groups and anecdotal evidence we had accumulated. And you can see used by is an example of one that's really misleading. You know, an equal number of people think that it's a quality and a safety date, so every time we use that, we are potentially misleading lots of different consumers. The result of all of this is it's a significant amount of food waste. So this isn't all of that food waste. There's a lot of other things, and I'll talk briefly about a few others, but a household of 4 wastes, you know, somewhere between $1,300 and $2,200 annually of food. And based on data from the UK, we don't actually have great data in the US, but data there found that about 20% of that household waste was just because of confusion over these labels. And then at the business level, this is a little bit of outdated data, but the best number we had was about $900 million worth of food thrown away from the supply chain because the date had passed, or because businesses knew that they were going to be so close to getting it to consumers before the date that they just threw it away ahead of time. So this is really feels like a low-hanging fruit, and I wanted to put up some data here from a recent report that came out, the Roadmap to Reduce Food Waste by 20%. It's by a group called ReFed. I was on the advisory council to this group, and it was a collaborative effort of investors, business, nonprofits, consulting groups, and the idea was really to look at 27 different solutions to food waste in the U.S. and identify those that were most cost effective. And as you can see here, standardizing date labels came out as the most cost effective of the 27 solutions. And I think it's because it's low cost. Companies are already putting date labels on food, and in some states they're having to comply with state law on those. So having one standard for them would be, you know, one-time cost, but it's not something new that they haven't had to do previously. And it could go a really long way towards consumers making better decisions, stores making better decisions, food banks making better decisions about what can be then safely donated to people in need. So this is where we've, through our several years of work on here, really identified as the core kind of policy opportunity. One is standardizing the date labels and having one quality label that would be on the 99% of foods where it's really a quality question, and then a separate label for safety on those handful of foods where there might be some risk. And this isn't just our idea. This is what a lot of other countries do. This is the rule across the European Union, is that there's a standard quality label and a standard safety label. The language we've talked about using in the U.S. comes from the studies we and others have done. So from the data I showed earlier, you know, we're used to different language here. There's different things that are going to work better with an American audience. But it does make sense to tell people, from now on, when you see this standard label, here's what you should do, and if you see this other label, here's what you should do with that food. I think this will also make it easier to reduce some of those state-level barriers to sale and donation after the quality date. Again, if we know that some of these are about quality and about taste and not about safety, they're really about the food brand, you know, brand management of people buying that food and tasting it when it tastes best, then let's reduce those barriers when it's about quality. And then the other piece is really, whatever we do, education and awareness is going to have to be a big piece of this, because consumers are used to seeing date labels. So if we're telling them something different or new or using different language, awareness and education is going to be a big piece of that. So as part of the work that we've done, we had a really great experience of teaming up with another HLS alum, Rebecca Richmond-Cohen, who's a lecturer at the law school and teaches in media advocacy and is an incredible filmmaker. So we took over a year, what I learned was that it took 1 year to produce a 5-minute film, but I think it was because we really wanted to get it right. And our students got to be involved in every step of the way, coming up with the topic for the film, doing research, doing interview questions. A lot of the filming we actually did in Montana because, as I mentioned earlier, Montana has the strictest law around milk, and so they're wasting thousands of gallons of milk each week. So our students got to be on the news there, where they were on TV having interviews. A clip of it's actually in the film. So if you visit notreallyexpired.com, which is the link up there at the top of the screen, you can check it out. It's short. Because we spent so much time doing it, my hope is that as many people watch it as possible. And students also got to be involved in crafting this website, coming up with handouts that you'll see on there, and with the, some of the op-eds and media that went along with it. So it was a really great opportunity and experience for them to think about how do you do advocacy in another way and get points across and communicate these topics in a different way while still being legally accurate and faithful to the goals that we had for the project. And in exciting news, because of all of this work, federal legislation, the Food Date Labeling Act, which does basically what we've been asking for, standard safety and quality labels, education, making it clear that food can be donated past the quality date, was introduced just last month by Senator Richard Blumenthal and then Representative Shelley Pingree. So you can take a look at that, and we've been really excited about it. It's been great for students, and we had an opportunity to help them work on the legislative language because we were approached as experts in this field. So all through, it's been great for students, and it's been really exciting to see this go forward, and we'll just see what happens now with the legislation. So briefly, I want to mention a little bit some other work we've done. We've been working now on date labels for about 3 or 4 years, and through that work, we've been exposed to this whole community of folks that are trying to reduce food waste, get more food donated to people in need or recovered in other ways so that it doesn't wind up releasing methane in a landfill. So this has been a big piece of work for us. So as you can see here, redistributing 30% of the food lost in the U.S. could feed every food insecure American their total diet. So there's a lot of opportunity to kind of deal with both an issue of food that's going to have an environmental impact, but also for a lot of it, when it's still safe and wholesome and edible and healthy, getting it to people in need. And there are a lot of reasons for those barriers, and our work now has been looking at what are the policy opportunities to break down some of those. So as you can see from this table, transportation is a huge issue, and part of that is cost. I mean, it's going to cost money to get food from a grocery store to a food bank or to a food recovery organization. Who should be paying for that money? How do we incentivize this? And we've been involved in efforts that were successful to broaden a tax deduction that's available for businesses to donate food. And then liability concerns is a huge one, and so we've been very involved in thinking through what is the challenge there. Interestingly, we have a very strong federal law, the Federal Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act, which has state versions in all states that protect companies from liability when they donate food to needy individuals. Yet despite the fact that that's been on the books for, at the federal level, 20 years now, many people, as you can see, many businesses still fear that they're going to be held liable if someone gets sick. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking and brainstorming about ways to make it clearer. Some of the challenge is that at the federal level there was never any guidance or regulatory action. It's just a short statutory language, so there might be opportunities to flesh out some of the places where there's a lack of clarity. It's intended to be very strong and people should feel protected, but obviously if it's not working, there could be other ways to make it stronger. So in order to kind of push some of these other things we're working on, so there's me. You can see a little picture. There was just the first ever congressional hearing on food waste. So this was a House Agriculture Committee hearing, and I got to testify along with several others. And it was a really great opportunity to highlight some of the work we've been doing around ways to get more policy changes that could get more food donated safely and effectively. So the testimony is available online. I'm happy to share a link after the webinar for anyone interested. And a lot of those things have been going forward, particularly on the liability protections and other opportunities for tax incentives. We've seen a lot of interest, and it's been great for our students to be able to be sitting with us, seeing what the challenges are on the ground, coming up with policy ideas, and then getting to be on the phone with legislators and thinking about how can we really effectuate change and make this, you know, more successful. The other thing that's been exciting to see is that there's really seems to be strong bipartisan support for this issue and an acknowledgement that reducing the amount of food wasted can impact so many other social challenges and social issues. At the state level, we've been doing work this past year in 10 different states, and this has been states calling us up and saying, we're trying to figure out how to reduce food waste. At the state level, can you help us? So our work there has ranged from doing trainings to helping with state level legislation, and here you can see some of the work we've done in Massachusetts, which was really exciting. We put together some fact sheets, which you can see kind of image of those there, that were for some of the key legal questions that businesses have. So the top one there is on date labeling laws. We had one on liability protections and one on tax incentives. And then we helped Mass Department of Environmental Protection and Recycling Works, which is a program of the Center for Ecotechnology, to put together best practices for diverting food for donation, which is sort of a very short guide that says, if you want to donate food safely and in compliance with the law, here's what you need to do. So we've been excited, and we've been, you know, we're going to be working with some new states in the coming months as well. It's been great to see all the energy around that. And then lastly, we've been doing a lot raising awareness, speaking at conferences, speaking to, you know, on the news and in media, and we are going to be hosting our own conference here, as you can see, in just a few weeks. We are expecting about 350 attendees, which is really fantastic, and it is co-sponsored by us, the EPA, Mass Department of Environmental Protection, and Recycling Works. And it's mainly a two-day conference, the 28th and 29th, and we're preceding it with a one-day workshop that was by application only for food recovery entrepreneurs. So these are sort of innovative startups and nonprofit and for-profit arena that are coming up with new ways to get food that is going to be wasted and get it to people in need, or turn it into another food product like juices or soups, or some of them are technology apps, databases that help connect food donors with food recipients. So that's been really exciting, and that one, the workshop, we're doing in partnership with a colleague from Harvard Business School and sponsorship from the Harvard Program for Harvard Business and Environment Initiative. So we will have videos from every session available on our website afterwards if anyone wants to see more about that, and we're just excited about the energy that we've seen. So I want to briefly talk about another area that we've done work in. It's funny, there's so much energy around food waste. I feel like we are becoming a center of food waste, but there are a lot of other places where our legal you know, ability to understand the laws around the food system can have a huge impact. So I want to briefly talk about one of those. And this is our work with what are called food policy councils. So food policy councils are a relatively new development. They can be kind of created through executive order or legislation, or just be a group of stakeholders that are coming together at the local or state level and saying, we really want to better understand the laws that regulate food and figure out ways to have, you know, more food produced locally, get healthier food into schools and hospitals and farmers markets, increase access. They all have their own agendas, but it's been really exciting to see them come together and then be able to really serve as the legal counsel and the kind of policy strategists with these food policy councils. So there are now over 200 food policy councils existing in North America, and we've worked with a big group of them. So here you can see the logos and images of just a handful of the different councils we've worked with over the past few years. And we provide a range of different assistance, but it's a great way for students to really get hands-on experience working in a, at the state level, at the local level, kind of seeing what it is to do work for a coalition which has its own challenges and opportunities. So to give you a sense of what that work looks like with some of these councils, we do a lot of individual client work with individual councils, which can be supporting new council development, helping people come together and understand why creating a food policy council is beneficial. We've helped some of them do their bylaws or create their leadership teams. Then we'll help them identify some of their priority issues, and we can do this through, we've done a lot of trainings, we have slide decks we use, and helping facilitate kind of community meetings for them to strategize around the things they really want to change. And then we will help with some specific projects. So they'll say, thank you for your help. We really now want to come up with some policies that can promote farmers markets in our state. And I'll give an example in a minute. And then from all of the learning we've done with individual councils, we've put out some general resources that are used by food policy councils across the country and actually globally. So here's an example of new council development. We helped form the Mississippi Food Policy Council, which the way that I actually first got involved in this food work was that I spent 2 years in Mississippi doing work as the joint Harvard Law School, Mississippi State University Delta Fellow. And the idea was to do organizing community development around health. And I learned very quickly that food was such a huge component of that and was something really on the mind of the community. So we helped form this council in 2010. We helped them create their board and their website and their bylaws, and then have worked with them for years on figuring out their priorities, and have helped them pass 7 different laws in Mississippi that supported farmers markets, local food production, farm to school, or procurement of local products for sale in schools. In terms of identifying priority issues, here's an example of some work we've been doing the past few years in Navajo Nation. And what we did there was, I'll show in a minute we have these general food policy toolkits, but what we learned was that the legal structure there is so challenging and complex that the most useful thing we could do for our clients there was to help them better understand on a range of issues what they could do on their own, what things were under federal control, what was under state control, and how to kind of navigate that landscape. And we've now been working with them on implementing some of the priorities from this toolkit. For example, they're actually very interested in school and initiatives to get more local food into schools, but it gets into complicated questions of who has control over what schools. Are they Navajo schools? Are they state public schools that have Navajo children in them? Are they Bureau of Indian Education schools? So that's been really challenging but also fun work for our students. And then in terms of specific policy projects, here's an example of one of the bills that we worked on in Mississippi, and this one was to help eliminate the sales tax at farmers markets in the state. So Mississippi has a sales tax for groceries at retail stores, but there's an exemption for food sold on the farm, and we were able to work with advocates and the Food Policy Council and farmers there to clarify that farmers markets also would be tax exempt. And the idea was really, if people can go to the farm and buy this food and not pay tax, but we think farmers markets are a great way to get communities together to get healthy food to members of the community. And in fact, we learned and we were able to show the legislature that they were actually spending more money by paying their tax inspectors overtime to go out on the weekends and inspect the farmers markets and give them citations than they were actually collecting on the tax. So that was something that we worked on there with the council. And then here's just a picture of some of the general resources we've done. These are 2 different toolkits. We did one for state level food policy councils and one for local level ones. And I'll show you here the table of contents for the state one so you can get a sense of what it includes. So when councils are coming together looking at what they can do, this is sort of a roadmap to some of the different issues they can work on. And in each chapter, it gives examples from other states, other cities of here's what California did, here's what West Virginia did. It gives them a good sense of what opportunities are out there for them to do. And I have a chart here just to show one of the things I think that we've done in these toolkits that adds a lot of value is going through certain issues and explaining very clearly what can be done at the federal versus state versus local level, because that's often the part that really trips people up who aren't very familiar with the legal landscape. So I want to, in the last few minutes, tell you a little bit about where our clinic and our food law program here at HLS fits into the national landscape and what we've been doing beyond the law school. So a few years ago, I was really interested in this question of, I'd heard from a lot of other programs that were starting to teach food law courses or clinics. So with a colleague, Balin Linnigan, we did a sort of overview of what the field of food law and policy looks like in law schools, and then the growth of this field. So just briefly, I think the way we really saw this is food law and policy is an outgrowth of agricultural law and food and drug law. It takes elements of both, but it's its own topic because it really spans other issues too. And as you can see here, the way that we teach the course and many others do from the syllabi we collected goes from production, the Farm Bill, agricultural subsidies, through processing of food. There's state and local concerns. We look at different agencies. Unlike agricultural law, which is really focused on the production side, or food and drug law, which is very heavily focused on what the FDA does, we look at the USDA and EPA and other agencies as well. So the other thing we did in the article was we tried to sort of show that how food law and policy measured up as an academic field. In order to do that, we made a list of 10 elements of what an academic field includes: scholarship, courses, centers, journals, professional associations. And then we looked at food law and policy, and because we were looking at it in comparison to its predecessors, we compared it to food and drug law and agricultural law. And as you can see here, it matched up very favorably, and some of our work since then has been how do we help flesh out some of the areas that are missing, and really building out this academic field. So I'll talk about that too. And here's just a little more detail. We found at that time, this was 2013 data, 20 of the top 100 law schools had a food law and policy course, as distinct from an FDA law course or an agricultural law course, and even more have courses in the interim, so we'll be kind of updating that data soon. 30 clinics at 23 law schools had worked on food law and policy projects. We were the first dedicated food law and policy clinic, but others have launched clinics since then, and there's a few that are going to be launching in the coming year at different law schools. And there's some more data there just about the scholarship in this field, how much it's grown since 2000, and the creation of the Journal of Food Law and Policy, which is a dedicated journal. And we've also been doing work to bring together students and faculty from this field. So this was an event we held last October here at HLS. It was basically a food law boot camp for law students, and we were overwhelmed. We actually had double the number of applicants as space, and in the end we brought 100 law students from 50 schools, and they actually represented 30 different states. So we brought them here for the weekend, and we had faculty from HLS and from other schools, as well as attorneys and other speakers, talking to them, teaching them in seminars. They did tours, they did a policy simulation, and here you can see some pictures. There's Dean Minow welcoming the students, which it was very exciting for students to see the Dean of Harvard Law School stand up and say food law and policy is a field, it's an important field. She said food justice is social justice, and the students were really excited. And you can see up there as well Peter Barton Hutt, who's sort of the father of food and drug law and has been teaching it here for over 20 years, and then our two students who are presidents of the Harvard Law School Food Law Society, who also got to speak. And then here's a few pictures just of the students on one of the tours, and then up doing one of their seminars was on agricultural law. The students were so excited that we've helped them launch a food law student network, and that went live just a few weeks ago. And we are also excited that we are going to be having a second food law student leadership summit this fall. We're hosting it at Drake Law School in Des Moines, Iowa. So we'll be sponsoring it with them, and we're expecting great turnout again. And it was such a great experience. We're excited that we're able to offer it to more law students this year. And lastly, I've been working with faculty from around the country to launch a professional association for food law and policy faculty and institutions. So this went live earlier this spring. It's called the Academy of Food Law and Policy. We have over 70 members, and this is just about a month. And anyone that joined by June 1st is a founding member, including institutions. So you can see here there were 14 law schools that joined as founding members of the Academy, and we are now building out the committees for that and beginning the work of this Academy. But I think just as an opportunity to build collegiality, to show the Academy that this is a really vibrant and growing field of law, and build support for our colleagues at other schools that want to be able to teach and write and work in this field as well. So that's just a sense of some of the things we're doing. And I'm eager to answer any questions and to be able to share some of these resources as well.
Thank you, Professor Broadleib. We have a number of questions for you. The first one, is our system of date labels different than the system in other regions of the world? I'm curious whether or how much it explains the waste pattern differences from continent to continent.
That's a really great question. So I sort of alluded a little bit to the system in the EU, which is that they've had standards for date labels, a standard, they say best by for food where it's a quality issue and use by for food that's a safety issue. They've had some challenges as well, so I don't want to say that they've, all's been good there and all of the food waste here is because of that. But I think interestingly, this was something where when in the 1970s states started passing all of these different state level laws, there was really an acknowledgement at the federal level that this might be a problem. And in one congressional session from 1973 to 1975, 10 different bills were introduced to standardize date labels, and there were reports by the GAO and others saying this is going to be a huge issue, we're really going to confuse people, and we weren't able to move any of those forward. And I think fast forward 40-some years, and we're in a situation where people originally wanted these dates for freshness and quality, and most consumers don't know that anymore. So I don't think we can attribute all of the excess of food waste country to date labels, but I do think that making them clearer can help people reduce their waste. And I believe also that educating people about the new date labels, if we do standardize them, and helping people understand how much food they're wasting can have a spillover effect into waste of other food items in people's kitchens and pantries that maybe don't have date labels on them, but like fruits and vegetables that might have a bruise on them and people just throw them out. I think if people are more aware of this, then they can find ways to be more creative with those foods and not just toss them.
Another question, have you considered working on the deficits in U.S. food labeling, specifically on deficiencies in allergen labeling or on food safety in light of recent massive recalls due to peanut contamination of both cumin and wheat flour in the supply chain in two separate instances?
I think there's, as probably, hopefully you've gathered from this, there's so many interesting and complex issues in the food system. And one of the things that's been really interesting for us and why I think there's so much work to do is that the priorities in our food system, the way that we grow and produce and ship and sell food have changed so much over time. So there's a lot of places where there's opportunity to really strengthen the legal, the legal landscape. One of the things it's been a challenge for us because there's so much to do, but also one of the ways that we've tried to make those decisions is by really focusing our work around places where we have either a client or a partner or there's an active thing that we can engage in. And I think that's part of that is really in our roots as a clinic and an opportunity for students to get that chance to work with clients and partners, prepare things for them. It's also been a way for us to leverage our size. I mean, we're doing a lot of work, but we're still a relatively small program. So on projects that we do, it's usually a government agency, a coalition, a nonprofit, a business coming to us and saying, can you help us work through this issue? And we'll choose them because we think they have greater societal impact. But I think all the things you mentioned, I'm sure many others are thinking of other things we can work on, and we are excited to work on all of them, but also looking for a partner or client that can really ground us in what's really needed to make a difference in that area.
Do manufacturers apply a lowest common denominator and apply date labels across all products shipped nationally to meet the most strict state requirement?
Yes, that's a great question. So I didn't really mention this, but there are 9 states that right now have no state law around date labels. One of those is New York, interestingly. But if you go to any store in New York, and I'm sure there are many people from New York on this webinar, if you go into any store, you will see date labels on almost every product in the store. So certainly it's not a best practice to not have any state rule, because I think what happens in those states is the manufacturers just will say, okay, the strictest state was Massachusetts or whatever, and we'll put the dates on that, and then New York just sort of, is an innocent bystander winding up with dates. The other interesting piece of that is that New York City actually for a while had a date label requirement on milk, and they eliminated it in 2010, and they had a very interesting in the regulation, when they repealed it, they had a really interesting statement about how they had realized that this wasn't making anyone safer, it was counterproductive, and in fact didn't comply with the rest of the state, so they eliminated that. But yet every milk you would see in New York City will have a date label, and consumers likely are throwing them away just like they are across the country.
If the state regulations are not based in science, as you contend, what is the policy justification for the statutes? If the justification is a consumer's right to know, how would any of these statutes be less viable or credible than, for example, Vermont's recent enactment of a GMO labeling law?
So that's a great question. I think there's a really big difference between the two, and I think part of it is that a lot of the reason these state statutes were passed is I think legislators, in fact, and we've talked to some of them who have worked on these state laws, went to the store for a barbecue, they picked up a bag of hot dog buns and said, these are past the date. How can this be allowed? We're harming our consumers. And, there wasn't really good research or data or evidence out there about what the dates meant. So when we weren't looking at it from a question of food waste and we're just looking at the question of safety, it's very easy to say, well, when in doubt, throw it out, better safe than sorry, who cares if we throw away a lot of food. And so in efforts to standardize this language, we've been very careful about trying to push for things that would make the labels more standard and more clear rather than eliminating or taking any information away. So to the extent that consumers do want this information, they're used to having it, and they would be very upset if suddenly none of their food had date labels on it. We're trying to keep the information on there, but just make it actually clearer and serve consumers better. So, that's been a challenge. Early on in our work, we thought, well, for shelf-stable food or certain foods that this date is really divorced from reality, maybe we should just have it taken off. But I think we know consumers really want this. They're looking at information, they're looking at labels, and so we want to let them keep doing that. But just the idea would be that if we can make it clearer and not have people wasting money because they think that they're doing something that's safer for their family.
Is the data set publicly available for the April 2016 National Survey of Consumer Perceptions of Date Labels?
The data set is not publicly available yet. We are working on an article with our colleagues at Center for a Livable Future and National Consumers League that will include the data set. Part of why we wanted to get out some of the data early was because this legislation that I mentioned was moving forward, and our data was very, very helpful to figuring out the language that could be included in that. So we released a short, 4-page overview of the data that is on our website, and I can share that. And then we'll be doing a more in-depth overview of some of the interesting things we found. One of the interesting things we found, for example, is that, and I think this is, really telling about how important this is, millennials as an age group were most likely to throw away all foods. They were most likely to believe that the date labels were all safety. They're most likely to believe that the dates were set under federal law. So I think looking out ahead, we're seeing younger consumers maybe throwing away even more food, and I think now's the time to kind of figure out a way to get out ahead of that. So I'm happy to share a link to the data that we have so far, and then we'll be coming out with an article that goes into a little more detail on that.
Who are your greatest partners and what are your greatest obstacles in working with food producers and retailers on these issues?
Who are our greatest partners? Well, that's hard. I'm supposed to say some are greater than others. We've been really lucky to work with a lot of incredible partners. I think, you know, I've mentioned a few of them, and as I said, almost everything we work on, it's the very, very rare exception that we've put something out that's been only ours. And I think that's partly, again, because we're small, we're trying to leverage our size and our resources, but also because for students, it's really an opportunity for them to make connections with other nonprofit organizations or communities and learn about that client relationship. So I don't want to say any partners are our greatest partners. In terms of challenges, of course, you know, this is hard work. I think that there are you know, there are a lot of competing interests. One thing that's been exciting, and I think one reason I've loved working in this space and across food policy, and then particularly within the realm of food waste, is that there are still a lot of areas of shared interest and places where you know, industry and consumers and government and, you know, activists can align around saying, you know, we have some laws on the books that are outdated that really were meant for a food system that was done differently. So we've done a lot of work in places where we found that there's consensus. And I would say in food waste that's definitely true. I think, you know, I don't know what will happen with date labels, for example, but we've seen that industry is actually coming to the table as well and saying having this patchwork of state laws doesn't really benefit us. New states have passed laws that they've had to keep up with and change their labels, and you know, in fact, with this legislation that came out, several companies like Campbell's, Nestle, General Mills spoke out in support of national standards and national legislation. So I do think there's still a lot of area for building consensus. But I think it's hard too. It's hard to, you know, we want to be really sure that the work that we're doing isn't causing other unintended consequences. So we're very conscious in our work of trying to bring a lot of people to the table and ask the right questions and you know, engage a bunch of different stakeholders.
The IRS has charitable contributions of food inventory on its priority guidance plan. Current rules actually encourage dumping food in some cases rather than contributing food. Have you been involved in this?
Whoever asked the question, I'd love to follow up more. We have been involved in, there's a enhanced tax deduction available for businesses that donate food, and it was in permanent law only for C corporations and had been a kind of year-to-year extension of that to all businesses and all taxpayers, starting in 2005 actually, post Hurricane Katrina, as a way to encourage more food donation. And what we saw in the year after that was that there was a huge increase, you know, almost immediately in food donations because of that. So that actually was something we'd been working on. We had written about how it would make a lot of sense to extend that in permanent law to all businesses, and that was done in the omnibus budget that passed last December. And in fact, we have also on our website a guide that we put out with partners at the Food Recovery Project at the University of Arkansas that goes into detail on how that enhanced tax deduction works, who's eligible for it now, you know, all businesses, some of the other things that changed. For example, also under that law, it was increased from being capped at 10% of a business's income to being capped at 15%. But there's still ways to strengthen that. I mean, we've seen from some of our work with farms, which, you know, a lot of food waste occurs on the farm. There's fruits and vegetables that aren't as beautiful as we want to see in grocery stores, or, you know, farms will plant extra fields to make sure they have enough to meet their contracts. And getting that food from the farm is very costly, but it's also really nutritious, high-quality food. And what we've seen is that the tax deductions, because of the way they're structured, even though now farms are eligible for them, they're not really that great because you need to make money to be able to take a deduction. So most farms don't make all that much money. So this is something we've been thinking about, and I'd love to follow up with whoever asked that question too.
And our final question, with several areas of important focus, what would you say is the nation's top food policy priority today?
So I would say there's two things I think that are on my mind as being top priorities. One, I mean, we talked a lot about food waste, and I think just to stress that in any issue we look at across the food system, that issue is going to be further exacerbated when we throw away almost half the food we produce. So if the issue is the environmental impacts of farming or pesticide runoff or antibiotic use or, you know, whatever environmental impacts there are of farming, or there may be, you know, those are all exacerbated when we then throw away that food. If the issue is hunger and food insecurity, you know, when we have extra food and we don't get it to people in need, we're not improving that. So I think that, to me, that's a reason we focus so much there, is because it has a lot of spillover impact. And the other thing we've been working on that I will be publishing this fall is a project with the Vermont Law School Center for Agriculture and Food Systems that looks at what would it take to create a national food strategy in the U.S. And it's been really interesting work. A lot of other countries have created national food strategies or national food policies. So we're examining ones from the UK and Scotland and Australia and Brazil. And then we've been looking internally in the U.S. at mechanisms we've used to do cross-agency work and sort of public-private, you know, work around building a strategy on areas like HIV/AIDS, environmental justice, health quality. So we're looking at all of these and really thinking about, in an area like food that impacts so many of our social issues and goals, but yet one that is really regulated across a range of agencies and across different levels of government, what are the models for ways that we could align and sort of better strategize? And when we are making trade-offs between different things, how can we make those trade-offs more thoughtfully? And also make sure that the two agencies aren't doing things that are at odds with one another. So that's a little preview of something we'll be coming out with later this fall, and I'd be happy to share more about that.
Thanks again to Professor Leib and to you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed today's session as much as I did. This concludes the HLeX Open Lecture Series for the summer. I hope that you'll join us in the fall for our next HLeX Open Lecture in September. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.